Hey everyone, welcome to Ask a Political Scientist. My name is Jones-Rooy. I am your host for this show tonight. I am myself a political scientist, hold your applause, and I am also a stand-up comedian. And one of the things we do in this show is we, at last, bring those two worlds together. We have an awesome show for you tonight. I am so excited to introduce both of our guests with you. Thank you all for being here. Let us get into it. Let me start to introduce political science and our guests. So for those of you joining us who do not know what political science is, I am here to tell you it is a very simple two-step process. Step one, use scientific methods to understand politics. Step two, then be totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family. This show is designed to, at minimum, affect my own family. Thank you all for watching, but hopefully also spread the exciting news about all the great work that's going on in political science. The topic for today is maybe the most grim topic, or at least certainly the most grim. Well, we've had some grim ones of late. One of the more depressing topics, but it's an important one, and we are going to have a great conversation. So our topic for today, June 25th, when governments kill people, repression, policing, and prospects for peace and peacemaking. Our guests tonight are fantastic. I am very excited to bring them on for our conversation, and our conversation is going to cover three main topics. We are going to talk about government-led violence, including perspectives from all around the world, what types of violence, causes, consequences, all of those things. We will talk about peace and peacemaking, what it looks like to have peace, how we expand peacemaking, and we're going to apply it to conversations that we are having right now in the United States around police and policing. So our political scientist guest, I'm so honored to introduce him to you today. His name is Christian Davenport. You can find him here and on Twitter at Engaged Scholar, which is, I think, one of the best Twitter handles I have seen. Brace yourselves, everyone. You'll be shocked to hear this. He is a faculty member at the University of Michigan. Yes, this show pretends to be nonpartisan, which is a whole complicated thing, because all humans are biased, etc. But we are definitely biased in favor of the University of Michigan, and so we are proud to continue that tradition. All right, so he is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and he is a faculty associate at the Institute for Social Research. Let us bring him onto the show and have you all get to know him. Christian, welcome to the show. How are you?
Fine, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And we are finding you in Ann Arbor, is that right?
You are indeed.
Excellent. How is life in Ann Arbor these days? It's been a while since we had someone from Ann Arbor.
There's if you recall, there's a store downtown that has the label the smallest big city in the middle. I always thought that was a nice kind of descriptive. And my other favorite is a T-shirt is Ann Arbor 6 square miles surrounded by reality.
Jesus. So. Okay. Yeah, so things are as I recall in Ann Arbor, I guess.
Very much so, I believe. Probably.
Maybe slightly more. For those joining the show who don't know me, I got my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I guess the main difference from when I was there and now when you are there is there's one more pandemic than there was when I was there, and a lot more protests. I would say that's the main differences.
That probably might be the only one. Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise the same. And Christian arrived around when I left, so we are ships in the night in Ann Arbor. All right, Christian. So part of the show is introducing great political scientists to the world, and so if it's all right with you, I have some ongoing introductions to share with our audience. Are you cool to see my internet stalking of you?
Okay.
Okay, great. Brace yourself. All right, here it comes. Wait a minute. There it is. All right. So this is Christian. In addition to all of his work at the University of Michigan, he is also a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. For those of you who are not scientists or aware, this is a very big deal. It's very awesome. He is also the either director or co-director or founder or co-founder of like a million other things, including the Conflict Consortium. I was wondering if your shirt was that, or if you just had a lot of shirts with circles. Tell us about the Conflict Consortium. What's going on there?
So I years ago, a friend of mine that passed, Will Moore, we were kind of sitting around and complaining about political science, as you can imagine, as you remember, happened.
It can happen.
More than we'd like to think about. And we were kind of like, okay, let's resolve this. Let's come up with some stuff. And so some of the limitations that we came up with were anti-elitist, anti-class oriented. We were just like, okay, let's try to get some fundamental things done for some people. Like let's get good feedback on their work. Okay, so let's convene groups of people that never would come together, or they would not normally come together. Let's do that. So we did that. The Conflict Consortium, the virtual workshop. Then we were kind of like, well, let's have a dinner. Let's bring people to dinner. Then we had dinner. Then we were just like, okay, so when we go to these conferences, why don't we have a mini conference? Why don't we rent a house, not just get an apartment?
Wow.
And then basically we'll have the dinner in the house. Those people will stay, and then we can basically have the space for the house available for people to come whenever they wanted to kind of decompress from the conference and be around some conflict, violence, and peace people. And so then we did the house. And so we came up with a bunch of resolutions, some of which got enacted, some of which didn't, to basically kind of resolve that. And then Will passed, and I've been trying to figure out, it's kind of lost its way. I'm trying to get it back again. Yeah.
Okay. Well, happy to help share the good news about it, at least, and bring it back. Is this, so our audience has been watching long enough that they already are familiar with things like APSA, like the Annual Political Science Association Conference, which I never expected to spend so much time talking about APSA. Would it be at big conferences like that you'd be like, forget this, we can start our own party in separate houses, A, and B, why was I not invited? Maybe don't answer that on air, but okay.
So our objective is to subvert every conference that we don't really find of complete worth, and that would include APSA, unfortunately, but almost any major conference that's really trying to make more money than it is trying to service the people that are there. So I think that's everybody except the Peace Science Society. That said, I'm president of Peace Science Society at the moment, so I'm definitely biased, but I do believe it is the best meeting in political science, and so it's small, it's interactive, folks care, you get the concerned attention from a great group of people, and so that one didn't need subversion because it was already kind of there. But if you're there and you don't know anybody, you're swimming in a sea of strangers. Then the Conflict Consortium was kind of supposed to be like a port in the storm and give you some feedback and some support and some insight and kind of like send people on their way in a way that we're not normally doing.
I think it says something maybe about the field of political science that the port in the storm is called the Conflict Consortium, and everyone's like, a breath of fresh air, thank God, I got away. I will say I'm hating on APSA now. I will say that because of APSA, I met my boyfriend. We were together because of APSA, not because we went, but because his friend did and ditched him. And then I met him. So
that says so much about APSA.
It really does. But I owe APSA a great debt of gratitude for thank goodness I didn't go that year. All right. You've done a number of other things, Christian. I'm going to name a few. The Radical Information Project, New Jack Academics, and Stop Our States. What is going on with all of these? I'm sure they're all up to very different things, but this is a ton of stuff. By the way, everyone, this is just what he's leading, right? Not just what you're involved in. I don't even know how you found time to come on this show, much less respond to my email. So how are you doing all of this?
I found your show quite interesting. That's why I would do it. The Radical Information Project I started interacting with a bunch of social movement organizations kind of like mid to late 90s. And then I realized that they were depositories of a tremendous amount of information that they did not know what to do with. And so I just kind of like, okay, so could I see that file? They'd like, take it. Do you have any of these documents? It's like, yeah, we do. We have a whole warehouse full of them. If you can get a truck, you can get it. So people just started giving me documents.
Wow.
And then I wanted to kind of do right by them and simultaneously kind of provide something that people could start to kind of pour through. And that's why I created the Radical Information Project. New Jack Academics was kind of coming out of grad school and interacting with my friend Darren Davis, a co-founder. We were kind of like somewhat disappointed and somewhat at odds with generationally the group of African-American scholars that were ahead of us. And we were just like, okay, you know what, let's do something that we think is going to kind of take on existing paradigms that are going to push some of these parameters. For example, a tremendous amount of work is done, as you know, on symbolic representation. I'm just like, what about food? What about clothing? What about housing? Can we get back to substance? Let's get off this other business. And so NJA was all about kind of like using decent methods, using important theories on important topics, and bringing that state of the art to the field in a way that we didn't think was being done. Stop Our States was basically to try to push back against, I think I might have been at Maryland at the time I came up with the idea, but it was like they got some grant to kind of work on terrorism. It might be the group that's associated with the GTD. And I went to some organizing meeting at some point in time, and then I realized I'm just like, the purpose of this thing is to basically point a U.S. weapon at somebody to figure out who to take out. And I'm just like, what's wrong with you people? The reason that people are engaging in terrorism, the reason that people are engaging in insurgency, protest, is because of state violence. Let's get to the source of these things. And so I was kind of like, let's stop our states, basically, was kind of where I went with that. And that like basically went nowhere. I didn't do anything with it, but it's like something that I kind of started. And basically most of my work is embodied within, I think, the concept. And I'm kind of like, it's SOS. How am I I can't get rid of it. I'm like,
you need to hang on to that. Yeah.
I will give somebody to that at some point. Yeah.
Yes. Cool. Well, we will all be on the lookout for it, or at minimum t-shirts about it. I think,
you know, I'm a t-shirt
strong move.
Fan. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is, again, just scratching the surface of all that Christian has done. We are going to talk about a lot of his research throughout the show, but just to flag how prolific he is and to maybe encourage some of you to think about buying his books, you can find links to them under the comments for this video. The Peace Continuum is, Christian, this is your most recent book, The Peace Continuum, What It Is and How to Study It. We will be talking a lot about peace and the Peace Continuum, so everyone, this is the suspense. Is that how suspense works? You say it's suspense and then you have suspense? That's what's going on. That's what's going on. Christian has also written a whole bunch more books that we are also, of course, we're not going to get into the appropriate depth on this show. We'll just have to have you back 10,000 times. But other books that Christian has been author for: How Social Movements Die, Repression and Demobilization of the Republic of New Africa. Another book, Media Bias, Perspective and State Repression, the Black Panther Party. Christian, I do want to make sure that we talk about media bias in particular, and so hopefully we'll get to some of the themes in this book. State Repression and the Domestic Democratic Peace. Those of you who watched this show, like the second episode ever back in March, when we all thought we'd be indoors for like a few weeks, we talked a lot about the democratic peace. So if you haven't seen that show, jump back to like show number 2, and you can learn about the democratic peace. And Christian is adding to talk about the domestic version of that. Very good. Christian has also been either the editor or co-editor on a whole bunch of books, including Repression and Mobilization, Ethnic Politics and Conflict, Violence, State of the Field and New Directions, and Paths to State Repression, Human Rights Violations, and Contentious Politics. So tons of topics and also some big themes. I see repression and conflict coming up a lot, and so that is going to occupy most of our attention for the start of the show. And just so everyone is aware, he's also written tons of papers. Go straight to ChristianDavenport.com right after this show is over and start reading. Christian, I want to make sure we bring on our second guest before I dive into all of your research. Are you ready to meet our second guest for tonight?
Definitely.
Hell yes. All right, so our second guest coming to the show is a stand-up comedian and very good friend of mine. His name is Alvin Kwai. He performs all over New York City. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram at Alvin Kwai. He performs at Caroline's on Broadway, which is a very big deal here in New York City. And he also performs at the world-famous Lantern Comedy Club, which, if you don't know about it, is the most important comedy club in the history of the world. And I will not hear a counter view on that. Let us now bring Alvin to the show. Alvin, welcome to the show. How are you?
What's up?
Thanks for being here.
Shout out to the Lantern.
Yeah, this is,
Comedy
I think,
Club.
The first time we've talked about the Lantern. Tell the folks at home and Christian, what is the Lantern? Unless you already know about the Lantern, Christian.
I knew about Caroline's. That's very important.
Yeah. Well, if you knew about the Lantern, I'd be worried, because the Lantern is, if you know what the Lantern is, you have mental issues. It's basically a comedy club in the back of a bar.
Yep.
Which is free, and you have to buy 2 drinks to see the show, and we just get like the weirdest people seeing the shows. Yeah. Because we're pulling them off the street. We literally stand on the street and you're like, hey, you want to come see a comedy show? And the fucking losers that are actually weird enough to come in and be like, oh, come into a dark room with strangers. They're the ones who are seeing the show. So just the awful place where me and Andrew spend a lot of our time on the weekends.
That's the New York I love and miss. Yeah.
Yeah. It's wonderful in theory. It really is. But yes, Alvin and I got to know each other standing outside in, freezing temperatures, asking people if they wanted comedy, and they would say no, and then we would say, well, do you want a $5 frozen margarita? And then they would come in and we would impose our comedy on them while they drank $5 frozen margaritas. Do you know if the Lantern is still in business now that we're all shut down? Do you have any idea?
No, I biked there today, and I've been biking there like just to see what the place has been up to, and it's it's closed. They're not even serving drinks outside. They're just taking a full vacation right now.
Okay. Wow. Well, that is indeed where Alvin and I know each other. Oh, I keep doing the wrong thing. But Alvin, I have more creepy intro for you. Are you ready for the treatment?
Yeah, do it.
Great.
Talk
I have
about me. I like
all
it.
5 of your books queued up. All right.
Yeah,
So this
can I just say, first of all, I counted like how many books? Like 11 books? Dude, if you put everything I knew on paper, it would be like a pamphlet. And the last flap of it would be blank. This Christian, you've written how many? But it's just insane. Just the books alone and the countless amount of paper. So I do have to remind you though that I am the only one here wearing glasses in this discussion. So you will respect my authority as an academic.
Right.
Okay.
I did invite Alvin mainly for the glasses and thought about photoshopping them onto this photo to credential you. I am curious, Christian. I've wanted to ask this of all of our guests, but I'm going to do it for you because I think you've written the most guests of anyone on this show, the most books. How do you write a book?
Open, blank manuscript and let it loose. I mean, there's
like on paper.
Wow.
No, yeah, I do, but
wow.
it's really so there's a book I read which is like the key is to kind of reduce the influence of your kind of conscious mind. You kind of like go to sleep with question, wake up, and just write as much as you're able to without judgment. And if you're able to do that, then you could write quite a bit. And then you get to the editorial process later on, which just invites something else. But if you can manipulate the subconscious mind to kind of be working on the issue, then you could actually be quite explosive. And both of you are very wordy, so I don't think either one of you would have a problem writing a book. I mean,
is this your way of saying stop talking? How great.
No. I'm like, I'm as a New Yorker, I love people who just like feel comfortable with the gift of gab, and y'all could roll. So it's like that's the key. And if you can suspend the judgment, then I think that helps tremendously with generation of text, and then just kind of go from there.
I thought you were going to say tequila, but okay, yeah.
How long does it take you to write? Like, I mean, I know your books are probably all very different length, and is there like an average time from like when you're staring at a blank page to when the book is like done?
No, part of the difficulty is I'd say the publishing industry. Actually, I could probably finish a book in like less than a year. But then getting it to something that somebody else is going to chime in on, not necessarily with helpful comments either, but someone's going to chime in on something, and then they have to go through a whole production process. I mean, by the time I've actually finished a book, by the time it comes out, we're talking a year to 2 years after the thing is done. And so I'm kind of at the point now where I'm just like, I'm going to start publishing my own shit. And it just like, and just start making stuff available. I'm just like, why should I go through 10 years of writing something, 2 years of waiting for someone to pay $40 or $80 for a book? Come on. I'm like, let me just release the PDF.
Yeah.
And then like, this is what Charles Tilly did. Charles Tilly would finish a book, and before the book came out, if you asked Chuck about it, he'd send you the PDF. Of course, you buy it later on out of respect, but it was just kind of like Chuck was not trying to interfere with knowledge acquisition, and I think that's kind of hindering stuff. So I can finish it pretty quick, but it's really an issue of that refining and then seeking out or speaking to the 10 people that the author thinks you should speak to. I'm just like, that didn't fundamentally change my premise. And so Chuck wrote a book once, and he's just like, look, if you want citations, go to my other stuff. This isn't that book. It was called Why. It was basically
it was his last book,
Why was just like, look, let me just tell you what I'm thinking. If you want justifications for it and any kind of evidence, go someplace else. And that's kind of where I'm like, I'm trying to take that space now and like take my inner Chuck and just be like, okay, yeah, that's it. If you want facts, then go to the website. You can see the article.
Just click on Wikipedia. So for those of you who don't are not political scientists, Charles Tilly is a very big deal, and I am very starstruck when you call him Chuck. Did you know him personally?
I did, but if you met Chuck, he like rolled that way very quickly. But he's one of these people that's incredibly personable. He collected people in many respects, and I think I just felt very lucky that he kind of for some reason liked me and collected me and gave me advice. But Chuck's the reason why I started writing books. I wrote this incredibly long article. It was like 80 something pages. And we went to lunch before the presentation. He was just like, why isn't this a book? And I'm like, really? He's just like, you add this to the thing you did 2 years ago, because he remembered it, because he's Chuck. Wow. And then he's just like, you put those two together, add an appendix, you basically have a book. Wow. And that's the first time I thought that it was possible to do it. And having his kind of suggestion just was the prompt that I needed to kind of like free me up. I'm like, if he thinks I could do it, then yeah, okay, let me go.
All right, so this show is literally brought to you by Charles Tilly in that case.
There you go.
We're here to talk about your books. So everyone watching at home, first, after this show is over, go to Christian Davenport's website and look, and he has a ton of data and resources and writing that is indeed very available. And then next, Google Charles Tilly because he's awesome. We'll talk about him on future shows now. A little bit more about Alvin, and then let's dive in. So Alvin was part of the New Talent Showcase at the New York Comedy Festival. He has been part of the Devil Cup Comedy Festival and was a finalist, as well as a finalist at the Punchline Comedy Festival in Atlanta. Alvin, I didn't know this until I stalked you for this show. You were on the Live from the Table Comedy Cellar podcast, which is awesome.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
I did this bar show in Brooklyn, and then the producer of the podcast was there, and then he asked me to be on.
That's a standard New York show. That's how shit happens in the city. I love it.
Yeah, which, I mean, that never really... Oh, and then, sorry, go ahead. I know we're running out of time, so go ahead.
What if I was like, show's over? No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, no one ever is important in the audience in New York shows, you know? So that was, like, one time where it actually led to something.
It's Alvin's cheer, really, that made me want to bring you on.
No, I'm just getting discouraged just because, you know, Christian, again, you just said, like, you write, you could, because you said, you know, the publishers, you know, they have, you know, their process, but like you can write like a whole book within a year, which is, Andre, how long does it take you to write like a 2-minute bit?
Oh,
like a 2-minute joke?
6 weeks. I don't know. Forever. I mean, if you like practice it and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Forever. Yeah, but it takes forever. Like if you want a 2-minute chunk, especially like people who've been doing it under 10 years, like it takes months.
Yeah.
And then sometimes after months, you just realize like this bit sucks. And so you just wasted all that time. So, you know, it's just really interesting to hear about. But anyway,
you also care about the human interaction side. In many respects, I'm just kind of like, look, I might be writing for someone who's going to pick some shit up in 60 years and be like, damn, that was good.
Yeah.
That's not going to work for you. You can't wait 60 years for a laugh, right? So
I am currently waiting 60 years for a laugh, just to be clear. That is the cornerstone of my comedy plan.
Yes, that is what I like to believe is when you're bombing on stage, you just be like, I'm just ahead of my time.
Yeah.
These people just don't get it.
Give it till 2080 and they will be rolling. The one thing, Alvin, I really wanted to ask you about is you were on the 9 to 5 cast talking about before you were a comedian, you were a consultant. Is that right? So you went from like real world to comedy world.
Yeah, that's right. I was a management consultant. It was a horrible job. I hated everybody there. And I hope everyone who works there is dead from Corona.
Well, they're all on the show. Here they come. Fabulous. So you think your decision to move into comedy was the correct decision?
I mean, we'll see in like 20 years, right?
Or 60 or whatever. Well, I think we're happy to have you here. Last thing I'll say is you can read about Alvin and some of his decision-making around getting into comedy in a very cool article that came out last year in the South China Morning Post about Asian American comedians casting off stereotypes and basically being like, yeah, it turns out Asian American comedians are super funny and awesome. And so Alvin was one of the comedians who was profiled along with like all kinds of folks that you've heard of. So that was a really cool, I thought it was a cool article. I don't know. Did you think it was a cool article, Alvin?
It was fine. That's a god-awful picture.
I feel like they could have found a higher res one, but that was it. All right, so that is Alvin Kwai. Let us dive into our conversation for today. The two things I want to flag are, one, this is interactive, so please post your questions on the YouTube chat. And if you see me looking over here, it's not me ignoring the guests, it's me looking at your comments and questions. And so I'll read those out if you have questions for Christian and Alvin as we go. And finally, every show we raise money for a different organization, different cause. And basically it's donate if you can. We do these shows for free. But if you feel like paying, in lieu of a ticket for a live show or something like that, or whatever you have, each week it goes to a different organization. And this week we are going to the Town Hall Project, which, Christian, this is an organization that is important to you. Do you want to tell folks a bit about what's going on with the Town Hall Project?
Since the COVID-19 thing started, what I've been most impressed about in many respects, and this is not just in the US, but around the globe, is people just showing up for other people. Not involving government, not involving anybody else, but folks just showing up, grabbing extra clothes, taking canned food, just doing things that are just, they're normal, but they're abnormal in many respects. And the Town Hall Project has basically spearheaded this initiative to try to find these organizations, help them where they're not fully developed, get them to the point of being fully developed, and also kind of like pull resources together to kind of like get this thing to be as seamless as possible.
And this includes the mutual aid networks.
Precisely.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. So all donations will go straight to the Town Hall project this week. So we're very excited about that. So if you're able to donate, thank you. So, okay, let's dive in. So we are here to talk about violence. We're here to talk about peace and peacemaking and policing in the US. So lots to get through. Let us start, Christian. So I first knew of your work as someone who studies violence and government-led conflict. And one of the ways I was introduced to your work is, there's war, which is the way that as a political scientist who studies international relations and comparative politics, which for those of you who are not political scientists, that just means other countries besides the US usually. It was like, yeah, if governments kill people, it's war. And then after 9/11, they were like, oh, it's also terrorism. And when I first heard about your work was near the end of my time in graduate school. And basically it just totally expanded my horizon to, oh, governments kill people in lots of ways, and war is just one of them. Is that a fair entry point to your thinking on conflict? Without question.
One of the more frustrating aspects of kind of like political science, but also popular understanding of it is, first we kind of like were enamored with war, and it was kind of like that was the big show, right? That was the thing. And in the nuclear age, it made sense. When we had world wars, it made sense. But then the kind of ubiquitous aspects of, okay, well, we have these nation states. They're basically predominating over their local populations on a consistent basis every day. And they have tremendous amounts of leeway and freedom and latitude to do what they wish with their populations. And so large numbers of people are getting whacked by their governments without close attention, because we were paying attention to war. And then we're paying attention to civil war. So it's the civil warification of conflict studies now that's a problem for me. And I'm just like, because that sucks up all this energy, and people then focusing on civil war. And it's like, it's not even the thing that kills the most people. Genocide is the thing that kills the most people. And it's just like, okay, genocides take place within civil war, but not all civil wars have genocide. So it's kind of like, all right. But then we have counterterrorism. Okay, counterterrorism annoys me because that makes it sound like it comes after the terrorism. But the terrorism is quite frequently responding to the repression in the first place, the government violence. And so my thing is, government violence is the gateway for understanding every other form of conflict and violence that we would understand or that we want to focus on. And all these horrible things that we say we want to get rid of are normally prompted by someone responding to state violence. And so So is the starting point for you, the state does something horrible and everything else is a reaction to it, and then the state can iterate and punish that reaction, like terrorism being a reaction? But think of like, live 3 blocks away from Ground Zero, Battery Park City. So lost some friends in it, all of that. But I'm like, the best way to understand 9/11 is, all right, why were these people in the country? Well, because of horrible things that were done in their country. Well, who did that? I mean, it's just like, we just don't take that step. I mean, Angela Davis makes this comment about like, we would have a completely different attitude towards immigrants if we realized that we're the ones, the United States, quite frankly, who destroyed their local economies, destroyed their political systems. And that's why the people decided to leave and then come here. Right. So it's just like, if we could trace these things back, we'd be a little bit better off. But most of the conversation with 9/11 was like, who were these people on the plane? And and how can we stop more of them from coming? Right. And that never led to, let's evaluate the governments that they were trying to take out in the first place. It went to, why do they hate us and our freedoms? And I'm like, what? Right. Well, and then I was just thinking it went to like TSA regulations and things like that, right? Yeah. Like taking your shoes off. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. So like, within like the definition of like political violence, like obviously I understand like it's the government directly, being violent against people. But what about like inefficiencies in the government that cause people to die? So like say like the healthcare system in the United States, the fact that like we don't have universal healthcare and like there's a lot of inefficiency and that causes like a lot of medical problems. Would that also be classified as political violence?
It very, very, very easily. There's someone named Johan Galtung, and he talks about structural violence. And his whole point is that structures are created that are not towards longevity. They're not towards, they will lead people to die earlier than they would normally have to, given the fact that the structure is put in this particular way. So the only reason I study the more overt, easy forms of violence is because structural violence is incredibly difficult to study. And it's hard to figure out whether or not that person died because of those pipes and how those pipes connect back to some company that was doing something that put something in the pipes that then led to the person. I'm trying to deal with something that is relatively easier to study, but generally when I do think of violence and my broader contextualization of violence is we need to include all of these things because all of these people need to be held accountable and all these things. And we can change, we can stop. If police violence were to stop tomorrow, just giving your perfect example, police violence stops tomorrow. Police are no longer jacking people up. They're no longer sitting on people's necks. No one's getting shot 30 times or broomsticks stuck up their asses. None of that stuff is happening. People are still going to be dying when they don't need to be dying. And then my research agenda would go, okay, now let's go after these corporations. Now let's go after these wealthy people that are kind of leading to these people to not have these things that they deserve to have. And so in many respects, it was kind of like, what can I spend my time on? And I'm kind of like, all right, this should be the first thing that we should stop. And then let's move to this other stuff. And so there's other people that are working on these topics. But for me, I think I was very much taken with overt manifestations of violent behavior that are just in your face. I'm just like, why do we still have this?
Yeah, like this blew up right here, and we can.
I mean, the Enlightenment should have gotten rid of that. I mean, there's all these things where these moments where we're just like, yeah, brute force is horrible.
Yeah,
we've had that acknowledgement for quite some time, and we're still doing it. And you're just kind of like, isn't this some arcane shit? And the answer is yes. So
has it been getting better over the period that you've how you've been studying for a decade more? I don't want to out you age-wise.
No, okay. I went in. I mean, I said, well, I went in 87, right? So I'm just like, I've been studying this since 88, basically. Yeah. Okay.
Has it gotten better or worse?
Oh, see, this gets back to Alvin's. Question, right? So it's just like, okay, if by better do you mean that states are whacking less of their citizens? Slightly. but and this is the thing that's jacked up. The reason why governments have perhaps used less overt violence against their citizens is because the citizens are now more tamed. They're now they're less threatening. They're now not thinking about displacing capital. They're now not talking about sharing a profit. They're not, I mean, if you think of the early 1900s in the United States, profit was something that labor discussed. It's like, it wasn't just like, not having an 18-hour workday. It was like, we get a share of the profits. We're not having that conversation anymore.
Can you imagine how radical that would be? Even Bernie Sanders isn't saying that. Yeah, or maybe he is.
I mean, think of that's just, so that was like the antitrust sentiment that we had early in the country is like that. Those people are gone. And the minute those people are gone, then everything else is less threatening. Occupy compared to what people were saying, the anarchists in the early 1900s, is a lot less threatening. Right. And so things might be better in the sense that people aren't being overtly killed, but they're being subjugated in ways that they're not quite aware of. And
killed in these structural ways that Alvin was describing.
Exactly.
So we have a question coming in, a question from Daniel, who wants to know this perspective that the state commits violence against the citizenry. How does that go with the concept of democracy? In other words, does this view assume that the state and the people are two different entities?
Good question. So there's a group of people, there's a group of political scientists who believe that if a government is engaging in violence against its citizens, then it doesn't qualify as a democracy. I'm not one of these people who are like, democracy are all the good things wrapped up together. Because the one thing that most political theorists and activists have told us over time is that if you want to control state power, then state coercive, violent, forceful power, then you need to democratize. So for me, that suggests that these uses of coercion and these forms of governments like democracy are distinct from one another. And so I think that democracy is very limited and narrow in many respects. It means that the population is involved, the population is consulted, there's a division of power. Notice that none of this says anything about coercion and force. Now there's a presumption that if I shoot a union leader in the forehead, that no one else is going to vote. Not necessarily. It's possible that everyone could be pissed off and then they're all going to vote. So democracy is not necessarily impugned by the violence. It's like we had lynching that was going on for 50, 60 years in the country. Do we have a democracy during that time period? It depends who you ask. But in many respects, it's like many people thought that they had a democracy. So that's a very complex question, in other words. But it's kind of funny, right? Because people, once Trump got kind of rolling and everything and started restricting things and the Muslim ban and all this other business, people were just kind of like, oh, we have authoritarianism and creep. And I'm kind of going, no, what happened after the his executive order Muslim ban? You have different courts that are showing up in different states that are countering him. You have people in airports that are protesting. You have petitions that are democracy came alive because of this person. So I'm like, I don't think democracy is gone. I think democracy has been made more robust. And so state violence and democracy, I believe, are different things. But I think that the general association is that the more people get involved and become aware, in many respects, we should expect the coercion and force to go down. But the sad part is people, through either fear or confusion, can point to somebody that needs to get the coercion and force. And then we're seeing the coercion and force again in the context of a democracy. And this is kind of why when democracies do it, it's worse in a way, because you'll have a popular buy-in in many respects that you don't even have the opportunity for elsewhere.
Well, and I'm thinking of popular buy-in both in terms of like, yeah, send in the military, send in the state troopers, or send in whatever, but then also going to the Alvin's question about the deeper, more structural, like, and tell me if this is overstepping what you're claiming, but yeah, no one should wear masks. Why should we wear masks? That's, we're our freedoms are being, and isn't that something that would potentially be harmful for people? So people have buy-in on that kind of indirect.
Yeah. I mean, so
murder.
The American
not to be hyper political about masks, but yeah.
The American thing that scares me regarding much of the current kind of coronavirus context is our general sense of selfishness, our general self. We're all in this together alone. I was reading someplace, and it's just like it captured the sentiment so well. It's just like, you can't tell me what the fuck to do. And I'm just sitting there I'm like, there is no collective.
Yeah.
But you talk to our Scandinavian friends, it's just like they're just like, okay, how do we need to fix this? Okay, let's all come together. There's a Norwegian phrase, dugnag, which means kind of collective work and responsibility. I'm just like, could you imagine somebody like on Sunday, hey, let's clean up the park? I'd be like, fuck you. I'm like,
what are you trying to rob somebody? What's happening?
Yeah.
The fact that there isn't even a word in English for this dugnag concept, which is very cool. So when you've studied a whole bunch of different countries and taken an international lens, but you've gone to Rwanda, Haiti, all over the place. Are there countries that you've seen, like, what does it take to get better? And I want to creep into your work on peace and peacemaking. But if we're all reacting to horrible things that the government is doing, and then they're punishing us with violence, either directly or perhaps indirectly, I mean, what are some countries that have maybe become less deadly? Or does the deadliness just become less obvious, as you were describing?
This is why if anyone's looking for an explanation as to why I'm like, why is he not on CBS? Why is he not on New York Times? It's probably because that's part of the message. I'm just like, I don't have some Pinkerest kind of like, oh, we're better now. It's more like elites have fucking won. And so since they basically eliminated our capacity to think of and imagine a new world and to kind of like transform it and then take people on, basically, we're now the passive defeated sheep that are kind of like looking for some new leader to kind of like guide us. And so in many respects, I think that the taming has taken place. And so this is a dangerous thing where we got focused on the violence in many respects. From a human rights perspective, we became focused on the violence and trying to eliminate state violence, that we were missing who was being killed and what was being killed. And so then we end up in this weird space where certain ideas are no longer known. And thus we don't have that reservoir or that idea that we could draw upon to fix problems. And that might have been the intent in the first place. And so my model for what a decent, humane society looks like is basically the Scandinavian countries. Now, the difficulty is they didn't really have tremendous inequalities to begin with. And somehow they've been able to institutionalize that flat line in many respects. And so that kind of suggests that they didn't kind of like get to peaceful. They were more or less peaceful once they worked out the thing with Sweden and so forth. Between Sweden and Norway, they had some conflicts and stuff. And so, but I think so trying to look to there for some clues is difficult to do because the populations are so homogenous. Like, okay, so we can't do a multi-ethnic version of this. We can do a version of this where the economic dynamic has been more or less established in a degree of equity, and then we have this homogenous population. And now it's kind of like, I'm like, oh, okay, so we can't have a multi-ethnic version of this. I'm just like, okay, so it's definitely not Brazil. It's definitely not Turkey. And you're just kind of like, so I'm still looking for examples in many respects. The thing that scares me though is the the answer that I've been running with for decades is, okay, we need to bring more robust forms, more deeper forms of democracy and democratization. We need to bring more people in. And I missed how dangerous bringing more people in could be for human rights. I always assumed that everyone would be like, well, golden rule type stuff. I don't want to be tortured. I don't want to be disappeared. I don't want my family killed. Therefore, I won't sanction it. Unfortunately, people are more than willing to support those types of initiatives if they think they're just. And so that's become scary. So now I'm like, okay, now it needs to be about education. We need to shift people's understanding of particular topics and get those people then to be active. Well, most people that are active don't want to take some time to go back to school or be taught. And so that becomes a problem as well. So then we have a bunch of people that aren't necessarily that aware. I'm thinking about stuff, thinking of the current moment, right? It's like people are talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm just like, who is that? That's a couple of organizations in a couple of cities, young African Americans, mostly run by some Black women that have some ideas of some things they want to change. Have they worked it all out like the old left and the new left? No. Are they drawing upon the history of understandings we have about dealing with coercion and force coming from anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists and all these other kind of folks? No. And so it's like, do I want to draw upon them to kind of resolve all our problems? Not actually. Or is the Black Lives Matter movement anybody who's out in the street, the millions of people who are fed up with what's going on? It's like, these are two different conceptions of movements. One is a very small, fragmented group of individuals that are together, and one is several million people that are frustrated with something. But people talk about the movement in a very laissez-faire, kind of relaxed way. And I'm just like, nah.
So it's like one thing that we all just agree on.
Exactly. And I'm just kind of going, who's informing these efforts? Who's informing the policies? Okay, so what do we do post-abolition? What do we do to defund? And why are we calling it defund anyway, when it's just basically reprioritize? Why are we not just talking about reprioritization? Because somehow this thing got some legs and then ran with it. And I'm like, I'm not sure who's running with it. Like, so during the civil rights movement, we had some sense of, it's like, okay, there's Bayard Rustin over here, there's King over there, there's John Lewis over there. We had some idea of what was up. I don't know what's up now or where they're getting it from. And that I find to be very scary, because I'm sitting there going, we need to evaluate the police. We need to evaluate prosecutors. We need to evaluate the military. No one really wants to make this step. I'm just like, while we're reprioritizing, why don't we reprioritize away from coerce and force, period? And if we do that, then let's get rid of the 800 bases we have around the globe, which empirical research shows that wherever these bases are, human rights violations around them aren't necessarily they're not going that well. And so these kind of systematic evaluations, and then we have all the research we have about people that just have contact with parts of parts of the criminal justice system. Just contact has a deleterious aspect on your attitude and your health. And I'm just like, okay, if that's the effect, then it's not just defunding. We need to rethink what these institutions are doing out in the world. And so I'm forgetting the riff now, but it's just like, but
I'm just like, and just so you know, the chat is mostly people going like, so Cole just said like, oof. And someone named Public Editor says, the taming has taken place, the elite won. Ugh. Like, it's just a lot of people just feeling sad in the chat right now.
Well, okay, so in line with that, and here's where the New Yorker in me comes back, right?
Okay, great.
Like, I'm like, the New York I lived in, you could walk down in Greenwich Village and then make a turn and end up in some streets that you don't necessarily know, and then see somebody with a swastika. And if it's one person, you might walk up, you might have an interaction. If it's 7 of them, you might turn and then run.
Right.
So my New York was always kind of like ready to kind of like get loose, but at least the confrontation and the parameters of the confrontation were fairly straightforward. Now you might not see the swastika, or you might see it back a little bit. But
Alvin and I have seen some shit while barking, but I don't know if we've seen a swastika.
I'm like, now the context is a little bit more complex. It's a little bit more obscure. It's a little bit harder to figure some stuff out. But there's something about this current moment where folks are clearly seeing that something is wrong.
Right.
That we're clearly seeing that something is broken. I mean, Alvin went to, why isn't the government taking care of the population? Why weren't they doing that ahead of time? Why was the Obamacare given and then taken away in such a rapid fashion? Why did we have the particular version of it that we had? Why didn't no one go to jail after 2008? Why do we have a ridiculous amount of policing for robbery and burglary, but nothing for people who are stealing hundreds of millions of dollars? And I'm just kind of like, where did that prioritization come from? And why don't we try to tweak or work on that? And there's something about hitting rock bottom. It's something about COVID, just sticking you in your home so you had nothing else to do other than kind of like wallow about your shit. And then here's some other people also wallow about this stuff. And you're just like, well, why don't we have this? Why are we living from paycheck to paycheck? A bunch of things just started to accumulate, and then protests manifested with kind of like, just like it was one, Most Def makes the comment. It's like, well, why did the straw break the camel's back? It's like, because there's a million other straws underneath it. It's like COVID for me was that. It's like, okay, we all knew that these things were happening. One more just kind of did it, but everyone was kind of available to be like, you know what? I don't have to be to work tomorrow. So fuck it, let's hit the street. And that dynamic, I think, is actually invigorating in many respects, because in that space, defunding, abolition, this is some stuff that some obscure radicals talked about in the 60s, 70s, and less so in the 80s and 90s. But now it's like front and center. We're having this conversation. What should our priorities be? We've not had that moment. Post-Cold War, why did we have this revisitation? Given that we're no longer focused on destroying the Soviet Union, which turns out it was bullshit anyway, but given that we're not doing that, what should we spend all of our money on? What should our national priorities be? That should have been the campaign. It wasn't. It was like, okay, new list of threats, new list of places to go. And yes, we need some more of those kind of machines in order to take these people out. Let's just continue funding these things. Now we're in this space. So I'm not crazily hopeful, but I'm hopeful, and I'm a movements person. So I'm just like, okay, I want the people mobilized, but I want them mobilized about the right things. And how do we get people to think about the right things? And so one of the reasons for doing your show is like, okay, well, you could write some op-ed, you could write a pamphlet, or you could write a book that no one's going to read, but we need to find alternative ways to reach people and get them in a way where they could hear something and be like, all right, I get it. Because the revolution will not be tweeted. It's like, it will not be Instagrammed. It's like, these are complex ideas. How does capitalism function? I'm like, good question. Let's start having that, have a show on that.
Yeah. And who does the deciding, and how do you decide who does the deciding? Yeah. So, all right. So I'm getting called out fairly in the chat for focusing on the sadness in the chat. I did see a few shorter messages that are varieties of oof, and I apologize. I saw that before I scrolled down to the rest. So further questions from Daniel. So ethnic identity is forged against the idea of the other. We otherize the USSR and then our own populace. We equals whites, them equals POC. We need to shift our view of American ethnicity to include all groups and individuals.
Amen to that. I mean, so my Peace Continuum book was, so for me, the idea from the book came from a conversation with Pat and Eric, and I went like, I'm like, this is conflict, that's peace. And so it was about establishing mutuality and mutual connections. And so I definitely, Daniel was his name. I definitely agree with the question in many respects, but it's an issue of what is that encompassing idea going to be? And so America is kind of tainted. People talk about wanting to address white supremacy. This is problematic in a sense, right? Because some people are just going to respond to the label in a way, and they'll be like, I'm moderately sympathetic. I believe that all humans deserve to be treated in particular ways, but that calling people out stuff is just not going to work. But what I don't like about the white supremacy label is not all whites benefited equally. And we're basically reifying race and ethnicity in a way that hinders the focus on capital and capitalism. I'm just like, a bunch of wealthy people benefit from discrimination. They benefit from people being hostile towards one another. They benefit from, and I'm just like going, I don't know about this white thing. I want to talk about this wealth thing. So I'm just like, I wish to, and this is kind of where the antitrust movement for me was so useful. Since most people were broke, they could all come together and figure out, it's like, well, you know what? Forget all these other differences. I still can't pay my rent.
Right.
They can't pay their rent either. These people can't pay their rent, and they have a tremendous amount of money. And so basically they forced wealthy people to hide their stuff. There's like, the Great Gatsby period was like, that wasn't working for this period. Everyone had to hide their stuff. And the idea of Pimp My Ride or any of these shows that would kind of like reveal how wealthy people are doing, that would not fly. And so there's something fundamentally that's off. And I think mutuality, that's why mutual aid societies work for me. It's like, okay, these are just people that are showing up for other people. Now, these might be broken down by race and ethnicity, but many of the organizations that I've seen, this is people that are not doing well, helping other people that are not doing well. And that cuts across race and ethnicity. But for me, I'm kind of like, so 9/11 from my perspective brought Black folk and Middle Eastern folk closer together. I hate to say it. Conversations about immigration and so forth brought Blacks and Latinos closer together. And some of the dynamics with regards to the current virus, I'd like to think are bringing Blacks and Asian folk closer together. And so there's something to be said. And someone might not want to go to the sadness or the negativity, but that lends itself to some clarity about the necessities of certain type of alliances and points of connection that we could have that I think is essential for us to get to, because we live in a society that is so incredibly marketed in a particular way that everyone is caught up in individualism and consumerism and their own stuff that they can't kind of get to some higher order level of understanding or connection. And so we end up, Andrea's got, I think she did a show on the collective action problem, which talks about this whole dynamic about why do we work against our best interest all the time? And we're never really kind of like worked through exactly how can you resolve this particular problem so we can get the most optimal outcomes for the most people. That's so essential for us to communicate, but I think it's very dense and complex. But partly we need to go so negative in order to figure out how to shake off all these other divisions, geographic regions. I mean, like, I'm looking for a t-shirt. Andrea talks about Michigan. I saw a shirt once that had every school in Michigan on it, and they were out. I wanted to buy it because I got tired of everybody kind of like running with their school. I'm just like, yo, we're all from Michigan. Yeah. I'm like, we're all from the middle. Forget this Midwest business. We're all from the middle. Yeah. And then we're just like, we're all public schools. I'm like trying to find the grand aggregator that brings people together. Exactly. And I think we need to think more like that than the isolated ways that we've been going.
I think
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I just think like the more points of connection there are between different ethnicities, especially, is like really, really important, because I think the trouble is, like, you know, when you have a lot of different ethnic groups, there's a lot of like misunderstanding between them. And so, like, I think, you know, we're like some white people in like the Midwest, like they may support police brutality just because they might just not understand different culture. Like if you saw the video of like the Rashard Brooks, you know, killing, and like because they were talking to that dude for like an hour before. If you've been around like someone like Rashard Brooks, you understand that dude was harmless. The dude was just like he was just drunk, and you know a guy like that. Yeah. Whereas like if you know, you never have hung around any like black people in your life, like you just have a totally different, you know, view of the situation. You're like, oh, that guy's dangerous or whatever. But if you've hung around people like Rashard Brooks, you would have known like that he's a harmless guy.
But think of what that takes, Alvin. It's just like the one good thing about kind of like New York was, you know, I knew of and went to Chinatown. I knew of and went to Canal Street to interact with various Jews that were basically selling stuff that I could then interact with, and then was going to school with their kids. And then I go to Little Italy. I mean, like, you got, despite the fact that they were these enclaves, you still could like move through them and folks were interacting. Of course, there was like a financial basis to much of it, but there's some other element where you just could kind of like, I've been to many, a dim sum place where no one really spoke English, and I'm just pointing at some food and everyone seemed to be cool with me sitting in there with my people. And I'm just kind of like, all right, you know, that's what I understood to be America and our interaction, right? And then I go to places like Massachusetts where I'm just like, I have like white kids in a pizza store that are chasing me down a block, telling me to leave their neighborhood. I'm just like, what's wrong with them? I'm like, they must really like their pizza. I'm like, I don't understand it at all. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic about how we then become how we overcome these things. I'm definitely not advocating the kind of like contact hypothesis, because it's like, it's a little bit deeper than that, but there's an integration of folks that we've not tried to pull off. And I think part of that is a revelation of how did everyone get here? How is everyone interacting? How has everyone generated or not generated the money that they have? There's discussions now about the wealth gap, and that's like incredibly useful to see, right? Just like, oh, I think Sandy Darity's got this work, right, which is like on average, whites in America are dispensing 60,000 to their offspring, whereas African Americans and Latinos, it was like 6,000 to 8,000. And I'm just like, I wanted Sandy to kind of expand that kind of like white thing, because that could be a couple of billionaires that are passing some stuff down that's just getting distributed for white people. I'm just like, yeah, most white people are probably looking like most blacks and Latinos. And I'm just like, our differences are highlighted, and they're shown in particular ways that mask this underlying similarity that exists in, I mean, what, there's 621 billionaires, and then there's like this drop off, right, of income and so forth. And some people are making some cash, but they don't have much land or resources. And then when you start, what's interesting about this moment is like all this stuff's coming out, right? Do either you know Pigford versus Veneman?
No.
It's this legal case that was about all these black farmers that just lost their land. They got squeezed out by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in part because back to Alvin's point, the Klan went from basically kind of like terrorizing black folks to not giving them loans for USDA. And then they end up with their land, and the blacks end up being dispossessed. And then USDA realized what was going on, and they offered, I think it was $1 billion payout to these black farmers. But I'm just like, how many industries did that take place within? Right. How many people were displaced? And then when you have these displaced people, they don't have jobs, and then they're marginalized, and they'd be a little bit more likely to kind of engage in certain type of activities that would be more likely to be policed. It's just like, we need to get everybody to kind of understand that path or that trajectory, and then start to kind of aggregate these across communities to figure out exactly how we're similar and how we're different.
Yeah, I mean, so Daniel has a nice point in the chat from a little bit ago about liking the idea of the American other shifting from black and Muslim to black and Muslim and Latinx to black and Muslim and Latinx and Asian. And is there a version of the world? Now I'm sort of adding my own question on top of this point, which is a good one. Is there a version of the world where you can just expand that all the way? Like, do you think that's a possibility, or are humans inclined? Now I'm just adding my own question, Daniel. Sorry about this. Are humans inclined to find barriers or other at some point? Insert the sci-fi thought of like, all we need are aliens, and then all of a sudden we all agree with ourselves, and no one cares that you're from different schools in Michigan or whatever, right? You know
what's interesting is like, I think, because like, obviously minorities in America, we have like a lot of similar struggles just being minorities in America. But I think like, it's interesting because like there's a lot more white people jokes being made nowadays, and you see a lot more like white people being offended at those jokes, which is, I think that's great, because that now you know how we feel when we hear those jokes. Now you know how it feels to be objectified, and that's like a bonding thing. Like that's because whenever I talk to any other minority, like the objectification of our race is something that we can always bond over, and there's something we can always make jokes about. And that's something that before, when white people were the massive majority of this country, they didn't understand. But now that America is getting more diverse and people are starting to like shit on white people a little bit more, it's actually good for like, bonding the different races, I think. It's
also good for comedy. There is there are some good jokes out there about white people.
Yeah.
I think this balance is amazing, right? So I kind of push back against the people of color label, in part because I'm just like, okay, so basically blacks became citizens in 65, 70, Civil and Voting Rights Act. And I'm just like, that's not that long ago. And like, okay, so we don't really want to address the time period before that. And we kind of like, just want to get started now. I'm just sitting there going, okay, now we're people of color. And I'm like, there might be some differences. I think there's some similarities, and I'm willing to kind of talk with some people, but we all kind of need to figure out what happened and then bring those things together in detail. But at the same time that I want to go through those details and figure out exactly how everyone got here, there's this higher order kind of identity that I think is that's necessitated for us to actually get to a point of positive peace. We need to, the highest aggregation will be we're all humans, and then we need to get rid of this territorial thing. But I think that's a real difficult struggle for many people to get to when they're embodied so much in their kind of local situation and local condition. And they're just like, yeah, I want to get with you and we're all humans, but And so I think that's a tall order to we need to get everyone to kind of acknowledge that we're humans and we just happen to be housed in nation states. And like the political science literature, there's like, oh, the nation states are done. I'm just like, if nation states didn't exist, then there would be no human rights violations. And then I'd have nothing to study. I'd move on to something else, right? But there's plenty of this violence going on. So I don't really think nation states are going anywhere yet.
Yeah.
And this identity thing is just like,
I
don't see much on human beings being necessarily pitched as I'm a human being, damn it. I'm like, we seem to be kind of like running with our set, running with our colors a bit too much.
Interesting. So I want to be sensitive to the time. I think I hadn't gone into this conversation, Christian, thinking about our focal point of, maybe police brutality and violence that happens here all the way up through the nation state as an enterprise itself. And I think it was Charles Tilly with the war made the state and the state made war. And it's been an entity with a monopolization of the use of violence from the beginning. And that's a lot of what we're talking about. I want to have time for one more question, and then I need to let everyone go. But this is a really important question. It comes from Public Editor. How much does demographic research reinforce historical racialization of a population?
That's a tough one. In part because, so this is Jim Scott, right? So Scott tells us that early nation states basically kidnapped populations and trapped them in geographic locales to create nation states. They needed someone to be in a location to be generating something that they could tax. And most people didn't go for that deal. So they had to capture populations. And so a lot of the demographic dynamics that we're seeing are about people being captured. And then the key is to then make people attached to this geographic location for some like higher order thinking. It's like, oh, I want to be an American. I want to be a New Yorker. You need to buy in with that. But we've given up so much, but now we've forgotten how much we've given up, basically, which is kind of like fascinating. And then we got slavery, you got people, moving countries. Patricio and Tim Moran, I'm forgetting Patricio's last name. He's at Maryland, actually. But they have a book on inequality. And their whole comment was, inequalities are so bad and they're so entrenched that the best way you have to kind of like alleviate yourself of a horrible situation is to move to another country. There is no modification of your country that's going to happen. And that's like a really kind of like powerful thing. But that makes me think about the demographic things and exactly what a demographic population is really composed of as it relates to these subjugated, captured populations. I think we need to put things into this kind of international dynamic of seeing who's doing what to what country and how people are moving around.
Right. And one thing, Christian, that we haven't gotten to that I wanted to get to is, what is the media doing in all of this? Amplifying all the problems, amplifying the divisions between countries, between races, between ethnicities, between genders, between whatever.
I think amplification sells, unfortunately, and peace building are not necessarily the best stories, because those events are a little bit too kind of mundane, but they have a happy ending. People want to talk about the sadness and the anger, and that's unfortunate, but how things are driven. But there's explanatory journalism. I just kind of came across this recently, is ready to dive a little bit deeper. And I think that's kind of it. We need to, in order to actually fix it and fix it permanently, as much as that can be done, we need to go a little bit deeper and take the time to do it. And I don't know that Americans have that patience, and that's very frustrating. Sorry, coming back to another negative point, but no,
look, we're here to talk about what's going on, and there's a lot of negative things to talk about. I will force us. Let's see if we can do it to end on something. Maybe okay. I want to know this is a question for both of you, and then we'll wrap up. What is something in all of this that gives you hope, or is there anything?
That's the mutual aid thing for me. That is revealed. That is revealed basically that government is irrelevant, that elites are irrelevant, and that we could basically do this ourselves. We can fix this ourselves, and that I find to be a very powerful position.
Excellent.
But I need to break.
Yep. Alvin, what gives you hope?
I just think, like, going back to the point Christian was making earlier, he was talking about how we kind of feel like more defeated these days, and we kind of feel like we kind of have to accept the status quo, which growing up, I definitely felt like that. Like, anytime you would propose, like, oh, why don't we pay teachers more? Why don't we do this? Or, like, in the classroom, they would be like, oh, well, that's not practical. That's not practical, or whatever. Even though we were spending like millions of dollars, like billions of dollars on like unnecessary like military spending.
Yeah.
But now people are starting to question that. People are starting to say, defund the police. Like, why are we spending so much? Like, and people are saying it with conviction, and that gives me a little bit of hope. You know, not taking things as status quo.
I'll take that. I'll take those 2 points. We are over time, so I'm going to end the show. Thank you, Christian, for being here. Thank you, Alvin, for being here. Donations go to the Town Hall Project. You can find Christian and Alvin links to their Twitter, websites, writings, etc. under the comments. My name is Andrea Jones-Rooy. Thank you so much to Christian for being here. Thank you, Alvin, for being here. And thank you to all of you who watched and who asked questions and who donated. And we will see you next week for a conversation with David Stasavage about the origin and future of democracy. All right. Have a good night. Bye.
Are we off or?
I don't know yet. It takes a minute.
I feel like one of those news anchors that are just staring at the camera right before they go on air.